role.
The role of the United Nations is crucial. The UN Convention Against Corruption represents the fundamental recognition that corruption is neither an acceptable cost of doing business nor a necessary evil. It is a serious crime, simply unacceptable.
There were times in which countries were reluctant to accept the fact that they had a crime problem, because that perhaps was considered as not reflecting well on the ability of or the success of the regime. All this was swept away, so to speak, by the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so there was a sense of optimism, a willingness to cooperate, a willingness to listen to each other, to set aside perhaps political differences, to work around substantive differences and find solutions. It was a leap of faith. This convention was adopted by consensus. The General Assembly adopted the convention unanimously.
The real push for the convention came actually from member states, and in particular it came from developing countries.
We are going into regions like Southeastern Europe, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and really sitting down with both public and private sector actors.
This is a convention designed to cover the world. And it covers the world because now you have 183 or soon 184 states parties.
It's also been very successful in terms of the time that it took to reach that stage. Other conventions are around for many more years, decades, until they reach that level of ratification.
The speed at which the nations of the world joined the convention is all the more remarkable given its large scope and legally binding character.
The UN acts as a mediator, as a facilitator to lead that dialogue between governments and civil society towards transparency, accountability.
If we have one thing which remains very strong is this collective political will. People are taking the convention seriously and their obligations under it. And that the mechanism is in reinforcing that.
It's all to lead towards building societies free from corruption and their citizens that maintain zero tolerance for corruption.
This convention covers a much broader range of offenses or crimes. Bribery of domestic public officials, bribery of foreign public officials, it also includes it. Embezzlement of public funds, obstruction of justice, money laundering, and then if you add to that also this, let's say the not so mandatory provisions, you also have for the first time offenses about crimes or conduct which takes place entirely in the private sector, where the public sector has no involvement.
In order to comply with the convention, states parties draft new laws on corruption, strengthen existing laws, improve their monitoring and enforcement efforts, and sometimes even design new institutions such as anti-corruption bodies.
It also brings other innovative provisions in prevention. It also brings an entirely new chapter on asset recovery, which exists nowhere else. Very, very innovative and very forward-looking.
But how far can these treaty provisions and the new domestic laws that implement them take us?
You're advising a company as to how to behave, and you do not know why there is a new legislation, why new legislation is coming, and how is this going to affect you. That's bad news. Through education, we have a chance of making more actively, more forcefully, the business case against corruption. In other words, why it is good for business not to bribe.
You've mentioned how the United Nations, the Office on Drugs and Crime, of course, works on laws, it works on institutions, it works on technical assistance, it does a lot of things that in conjunction with states parties looks a little bit top-down. You get this new framework, this new legal architecture and so on that reorients how things work. But I've heard from you that that's not enough, and that it's also important to do some bottom-up type initiatives.
So the moment was 2015 in Doha that this declaration was adopted. And a couple of years later, with the funding coming through, we were able to establish a program. And under this program, we have this one initiative called Education for Justice. The acronym is E4J. And under E4J, we have primary level education, secondary level education, and tertiary level education components. And under each of those components, we're developing materials on each of the areas that UNODC works on: organized crime, terrorism, cybercrime, firearms, human trafficking, migrant smuggling, corruption, and integrity and ethics.
An academic's life is it's not very glamorous, but it is an awful lot of work.
There's a lot of information. Not only did I have to read a lot, but I had to reduce and condense a lot what I had to say to students, taking into account what they know and being also able to give them the gist of what I wanted to achieve. UNODC does this for us.
Somebody's already done all of this beautiful work and packaged it, but not packaged it in a rigid way.
UNODC did the research for us and condensed the information. And what is very interesting is that it is in a module system which allows me to pick and choose.
So there's less work for, sort of course design work for you to do, but you can still sort of make it your own.
And it is a ready-made material which I don't have to follow blindly.
We're trying to educate and to provide tools and to empower youth to think critically, to engage in society, to understand that they have a choice, and to have the tools to actually implement that choice. Because I think that's also very important. It's not just about understanding that you have a choice and maybe making the decision in your head, but it's also about how do you act it out? And how do you act it out when all the others are swimming the other way?
And UNODC has now this program on integrity, which is good, because without having a management class that appreciates what is integrity and has these values and standards, you cannot get rid of corruption.
In addition, the UN has also created programs around whistleblower protection, judicial integrity, and asset recovery, all intended to curb corruption.
We must, as an international community, try to identify the weak links in the chain and strengthen them, providing help and support to countries that do not have the capacity, do not have the resources, and therefore they need the international community to rally around them and help them. The fact that we have 184 states parties is very significant, because that means that those countries have decided freely to be bound by that instrument, which means to undertake certain obligations, to make reforms, to make new laws, to change. Sometimes they have changed constitutions, and they have agreed to be subjected to a peer review mechanism. There was one issue which was very contentious until the end, and that was whether the mechanism was going to have country visits.
The UN Convention Against Corruption contains a review mechanism to help states parties implement the treaty. The motive for this process is the states parties themselves. With support from UNODC, they review each other's progress, engage in dialogue about challenges and best practices, reviewing each other's laws, and filing detailed reports complete with recommendations for future steps to take.
In the end, country visits are left to the discretion of the country under review. When that solution was reached, there were a number of countries that came to me and said, yeah, okay, we can live with that because we will never do a country visit. And I said to them, I will hazard a prediction. I said to them, all of you will actually ask for a country visit, and you will come back and ask me yourselves to have a country visit, and if you do that, then I will come and lead the country visit myself. We had a 100% fulfillment of that prediction.
Country visits are an optional part of this review process, but in the first 4 years, 140 country visits took place.
In a number of cases, that review process triggered very significant domestic reforms, also in the area of anti-corruption.
The fight against corruption led by the UN has taken on many forms, and while full of successes to date, still has a long road ahead.
professionalizing the fight against corruption, that is, I think, the next big hurdle that we have to take.
There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, and hopefully, if you're in this line of work, that motivates you to do more about it.
And we need civil society, a free press, and young people to continue doing their valuable work in bringing to light corrupt practices and holding individuals, businesses, and governments to account.
These other issues I care about, environmental protection or human rights, or even industry and efficiency and economic freedoms, these other issues I care about are all dependent on a deeper issue, which is integrity. If you can connect up